even though it's only virtual, I'm just very pleased that you're all here and happy that we have this time together, if only in this oddball circumstance. So my subject today is the American presidency in historical perspective or context, and I essentially want to do three things. I want to rehearse a bit of a brief constitutional history of the presidency, that is how it got established in the first place and what its strict constitutional history looks like. Then I want to spend some time talking about what I'll call extra constitutional developments that have evolved over 2+ centuries of American history and how they have affected the presidency, and indeed how the presidency has interacted with these various developments. Three in particular: political practice, secondly, developments in society and the economy, and thirdly, where I will place a certain amount of emphasis, technological innovations, especially in the realm of mass communication, which have put significant pressures on the presidency to be a different kind of institution than the Constitution provided for. So the tension between the evolution of society and technology and the more or less constitutionally static character of the presidency is sort of the major running theme of this presentation. I also will try to conclude with some remarks about how the presidency looks today and what the presidency looks like as an item in our larger political culture. And I put you on notice here. This, I hope, will be enlightening, but I don't promise that it will be uplifting, because I think we're going to see some deep structural issues in the nature of our political system and institutions that are approaching some kind of an acute phase. So let me begin with some numbers. There have been 45 presidencies, but only 44 persons who have served as president, thanks to the peculiar way that we count the 2 non-consecutive administrations of Grover Cleveland back in the 19th century. All 44 of those presidents have been males. All but 2 of them have been white Protestant males. 17 of the 44 have been elected to second terms, which is some kind of a rudimentary indicator of the character of our political system and its volatility. That scarcely more than a third of our chief executives, beginning in the 18th century, have been elected to a second term for one reason or another. 8 have died in office. 4 have been assassinated. 5 have been elected without popular majorities. 3 have been impeached. 2 of those in the lifetime of many people with us here today. But of all those numbers, the one that I want to emphasize the most is simply the number 1. By that I mean that the president is simply one of the 536 elected officials in Washington, D.C. Now, strictly speaking, it's 537, 535 members of the United States Congress, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House. And I'm treating the president and vice president for this purpose as a single political entity. So the president is one of 536 elected officials. And when I reflect on that asymmetry between the one president and 535 other elected federal officials, I'm reminded of a quip by the journalist Theodore White, who wrote several books on presidential elections beginning in 1960. In one of those books, he said, "The supreme duty of the president is to protect us from each other's congressman." Now, he meant it humorously, but there's, I think, a kind of a deep political insight contained in that quip. So let's keep that in mind, that the president is one of 536 elected officials in Washington, D.C., but one, the only one elected nationally, as distinct from the geographically specific places from which representatives and senators come. So let's go back to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, when those founding fathers sat down to draft the Constitution we've lived under ever since. It's worth remembering that among the innovations that the founders came up with at that Constitutional Convention, 1787 at Independence Hall, you see here the room, the outside of the building, the lower right, the room in which they sat. And today in Independence Hall, or nearby actually, you can visit a room in which there are life-size statues of the various people who attended that constitutional convention. A reminder that we remain historically fascinated with that moment, and we live with its consequences still after all these years. But among the things that was, among the innovations that the founders came up with in 1787 was the institution of the presidency. There was no comparable institution or office under the Articles of Confederation, and there was no executive function under the Articles, and there was nothing resembling what we think of as the presidency in the colonial period of American history. The rough equivalent to the president in the colonial period were the colonial governors, but the governors in each of the 13 colonies were royally appointed, not elected locally, and they were often royally resented because of the distant and arbitrary basis of their authority in the crown and in Parliament. So James Wilson, is representative from Pennsylvania, is often thought of as the person who thought most and advocated most for the creation of a strong presidency, replacing making up for the fact there was no president under the Articles of Confederation. And Wilson said that the method of choosing the president was the single most perplexing item that the constitutional founders had to address in 1787. So the debate about the nature of the presidency and what it would be was there from the outset. It's been a controversial institution, an innovative institution, but one that's been beset by controversy, and I dare say contradiction, ever since. So Alexander Hamilton was another person who, in the debates over the Constitution, excuse me, was also an advocate for a strong executive. James Wilson wanted the president elected by popular vote, what I will call a kind of plebiscitarian institution as he saw it. And he wanted the direct election of the president by the voting citizenry at large. He and Alexander Hamilton both wanted a pretty robust executive. Here's what Hamilton had to say about the presidency in Federalist Number 70. He said, "A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. And a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government." Again, a remark worth keeping in mind as we think about the history of this institution and how it is that history has deposited us at the place where we are today. So to repeat, James Wilson wanted a direct or plebiscitarian electoral mechanism to choose the president of the United States. He recognized, as we've recognized ever since, that the president is the one single actor in our political system who represents the country at large, not simply individual congressional districts or individual states. But of course, as we know, that's not what we got. We did not get a direct election of the president. We got the Electoral College, which is still with us. And the Electoral College is but one reminder among several of how wary our founders were of direct democracy. Another reminder of that is the fact that down until the early 20th century, United States senators were elected not directly by popular vote, but they were appointed by state legislatures, another indirect method of selecting popular representatives. So it's, again, these items are both reminders that the founders had a certain degree of skepticism about direct democracy, but the evolution of various political institutions has been in the direction of more and more direct democracy, and though it may be heretical to say it, that may be a source of some of the problems that we've faced in our own time. Here's another reminder about something that is important to remember about the presidency. And it's another set of numbers, if I can do that again. Article 1 of the Constitution comes first, the first thing to notice, that's why it's called Article 1, and it deals with the legislative branch. And it describes the method of electing the two chambers of the legislative branch and the functions and rights and responsibilities and limitations on the Congress. That article contains 51 paragraphs. Article 2, note the sequence, deals with the executive, and it contains just 13 paragraphs. And a majority of those paragraphs have to do with the way the president is elected. And one of those paragraphs has to deals with the way the president can be impeached. So again, here's another reminder in the numbers. The asymmetry between 51 paragraphs devoted to the definition of the legislature's functions and prerogatives and so on, and just 13 paragraphs devoted to the executive, is another reminder of where the founders thought the seat of government, the seat of authority and legitimacy in the government, really was most centrally located, and that was in the legislature, not in the executive. And again, we're reminded yet again of the importance of that asymmetry and what the founders thought would be the heart of government in the legislature, when we recollect that down to the 1830s, to 1832 to be exact, presidential candidates were nominated by caucuses in the Congress. The first convention of a political party to nominate a presidential candidate, taking that function out of the hands of a congressional caucus and putting it in the hands of a much more broadly based party, was a convention convened by the so-called anti-Masonic Party in 1832. And all parties soon thereafter, the Whigs, the Democrats, and so on, and right down to our own time, went to the nominating convention, which was meant to be more inclusive and more democratic in selecting a presidential candidate than the rather closed door, behind closed door function of a congressional caucus. So the very first innovation that we see historically in the evolution of the presidency as an institution, that is going to nominating conventions and departing from the practice of using congressional caucuses, was done in the name of more democracy and more inclusion. Again, a harbinger of what is to come in many ways in our political culture. So the system existed for the better part of the first century of the Republic's history, down to the late 19th or early 20th century. But by the late 19th century, a number of people were beginning to wonder if the legacy constitutional system, Congress at its center, and a rather feeble executive compared to parliamentary systems, where the prime minister is also the leader of the legislative branch, as well as in charge of the executive function, a number of people were beginning to wonder if this system was any longer appropriate or optimal for a society now approaching 100 million people, with a modern, rapidly industrializing economy on the verge of assuming major international responsibilities. And one of the first people to make a really sustained case about the limitations on the legacy system of the relation between Congress and the presidency was a young graduate student at Johns Hopkins University in the 1880s. His name was Thomas Woodrow Wilson, and he wrote a doctoral dissertation with the title simply Congressional Government, and it was later published as a book. And to this day, Woodrow Wilson's book, now 150 years old almost, is probably one of the most incisive things ever written about the nature of the American Congress and how it functions or dysfunctions in Wilson's view. It's permissible, I think, to read the title of Wilson's work, Congressional Government, as a kind of oxymoron, because the burden of the book was that Congress, by its very nature, was incapable of coherent government of the kind that a modern, industrialized, world power almost society absolutely needed. And here, I'll give you, just share with you one paragraph from that work, Congressional Government by Woodrow Wilson, published in the 1880s. He said the following: in the United States Congress, nobody stands sponsor for the policy of the government. A dozen men originate it, a dozen compromises twist and alter it, a dozen offices whose names are scarcely known out of Washington put it into execution. Policy cannot be either prompt or straightforward when it must serve many masters. It must either equivocate or hesitate or fail altogether. The division of authority and concealment of responsibility are calculated to subject the government to a very distressing paralysis. Now, I think you really have to pinch yourself. We have to pinch ourselves to remember that those words that I've just shared with you were not written in 2020, but 135 years ago in 1885. And many of the problems or issues that Wilson identified as residing in the Congress are still with us today. It's the place where presidential initiatives and all kinds of initiatives largely go to die. So criticism of the relationship between Congress and the presidency and an increasingly articulated desire that the president become a more active and salient and leaderly figure in the political system really dates from the very late 19th century and begins to become some degree of political reality despite constitutional restrictions in the early 20th century, especially in the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and, of course, Woodrow Wilson. And here I shared with you on screen another of Wilson's aphorisms in this regard when he said, "The president is at liberty, both in law and conscience, to be as big a man as he can." There is a very explicit declaration of the wish that the president have more responsibility, visibility, salience, and consequence in the American political system. So there are two or possibly three innovations in our political culture, largely having to do with the presidency, that begin to be visible in the very early 20th century, especially in the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The first has to do with the fact that, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt and the program that he called and campaigned on, the slogan he assigned to it was "a square deal." Roosevelt's square deal could be seen as the first instance of a president laying out a coherent, nationally scaled package of policy initiatives for which he, the president, would stand as champion. There's really nothing comparable to that in the 19th century. Various presidents expressed various aspirations and so on as they went along, but a square deal was thought to be a multi-pronged, carefully thought out program for a coherent policy package to take the country forward. And we see successors to that initiative of presidents laying out and campaigning on coherent policy proposals right down to our own day. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on something called the New Freedom. Herbert Hoover campaigned on something called New Era. We have a New Deal, and Franklin Roosevelt, of course, Fair Deal, Harry Truman, and on, right down to what today some have called the Ordeal. But the point is simply, without any joking around about it, that it's only in the early 20th century that the president really steps forward as the actor in our political system who aspires to enact a coherent policy package. And I would say only rarely succeeds in doing so. So some of the frustrations that we experience today in our political system, our polarization and paralysis, are in many ways built into the clash of expectations about what the president could and should and wanted to do, and the still existing constitutional restraints that define the boundary between president and Congress. And it's only on rare occasions that the president and the Congress really align in their aspirations and make for major transformations or improvements or whatever in our political system. So that's one innovation that comes to us from the early 20th century. It has to do with the president standing up now and standing forward before the electorate as the vessel and the agent of significant and coherent nationally scaled policies. Second innovation has to do with technology. We see its origins here in the late 19th, early 20th century. It has to do with the distribution of mass circulation newspapers. Two of the most famous actors in this drama were Joseph Pulitzer, seen here on the right, William Randolph Hearst on the left. Pulitzer's World and Hearst's Journal became organs for mass distribution of political messages and news in general. And Woodrow Wilson became arguably the first president to really use publicity as an administrative tool, or a political tool, I should say, when he used publicity through the newspapers to end-run Congress or browbeat Congress into passing major reform legislation in the 1913 to 17 period before World War I put a stop to a lot of that kind of reform. But reforms affecting the creation of the Federal Reserve System, for example, the first income tax, antitrust legislation, labor legislation, so on and so forth. And Wilson was an accomplished publicist and self-consciously used publicity, appealing to the public at large as a way to force Congress to his will. He was also the first president since first president since John Adams, actually, to go in person to Congress to deliver his annual State of the Union message. For more than a century, the whole 19th century, presidents had simply sent their State of the Union message in writing to Congress, another reminder that the president did not normally feature himself as the leader of Congress or as the principal actor in the political system. That begins to change, at least optically, in the early 20th century, and Woodrow Wilson, in some ways, is a shorthand reminder of that. But I want to stick with this business about communications technology for just a minute, because I think the chain of events that begin with mass circulation newspapers and their political utilization in the early 20th century is a chain that extends right down 100 years later into the early 21st century. All of the technologies change. But let's just remember what happens next. Wilson uses newspapers as mass circulation or mass communication devices to bend the Congress to his will. Franklin Roosevelt uses the next generation of technological innovation and communication technologies, the radio. Here he is delivering one of his 30 fireside chats. And on the right, you can see this is a statue from the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., where the designers of that memorial correctly, it seems to me, memorialized the fact that Roosevelt was an innovator in the dimension of political communication, particularly utilizing the radio as an instrument of governance, not just communication, but as a way to mobilize public opinion. And here again, we see the aspiration of James Wilson to have a plebiscitarian character in the presidency. We see that becoming a kind of a fact of life as presidents increasingly turn to talking to the public directly and trying to mobilize public opinion at large, rather than dealing directly with the president, with the Congress, as 19th century presidents were constrained to do, not least of all because these technologies were not available. The next innovation along this same dimension of using mass communication as an instrument of presidential political mobilization is, of course, television. And here we see John F. Kennedy, who at a stroke diminished the importance of both the radio and newspaper print versions of presidential press conferences by televising them live. So there was no need to turn in the evening news and see what the president had said that morning at his press conference, or to read that evening's newspaper, the next morning's newspaper, to see, because Kennedy had said it all on live television earlier that same day. And again, another move in the direction of an increasingly plebiscitarian presidency that mobilized public opinion directly for political purposes. And of course, that brings us down to the world that we live in today, where so much communication between president and politicians in general and each other is done instantaneously by communications technologies that were non-existent a few years ago and almost unimaginable to many of us in the last century or even the early years of this century. Now, some people have actually, if you can believe it, quantified this. I would not have wanted to do the actual manual labor to do this quantification, but somebody has, and they have calculated that in the 20th century as a whole, compared to the 19th century, presidents, on the average, spoke to the public directly 6 times more frequently than they did in the 19th century. And conversely, in the 20th century compared to the 19th, presidents spoke exclusively or directly to the Congress 1/4 less frequently than they had in the 19th century. Again, some numbers that are just another register of how the presidency, despite the fact that the Constitution constrained James Wilson's desire for a truly plebiscitarian presidency directly elected by the people, that nonetheless our political culture has evolved an institution that is increasingly plebiscitarian in its character and the way it deals with the electorate and the citizenry in general. From a president who essentially dealt mostly with the Congress in the 19th century to one that deals increasingly directly and instantaneously with the public as technology has evolved from mass circulation newspapers to radio to television to the internet, Facebook, social media, and so on. All right, a third innovation in our political culture that, again, first appears on the scene almost a little over 100 years ago in the early 20th century. That so-called progressive era, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, are a fertile breeding ground for many changes in our political culture. But another one that has its roots there and enormous consequences for us today is another political innovation, the primary election. The first binding primary election that bound the people elected or nominated in the primary election, to bound the electors from a state to vote for those people, was in Oregon in 1910. California followed suit just a few years later. And briefly, and I do mean briefly, in the next decade or so, there were many states that adopted primary elections to select their presidential electors and other candidates for office. For reasons that I won't distract us with here, but there's a well-documented history about this. In the late 60s and early 70s, primary elections exploded. When John F. Kennedy ran for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1960, there were only about a dozen presidential primaries, and not all of them were binding on the delegates selected thereby. By the time of the presidential elections in the 1970s, virtually every single state had either a primary or a caucus, which is essentially the same idea. And the whole purpose of primaries, when they were first invented in the early 20th century, and as they exploded across the political landscape in the late 60s and early 70s, the whole purpose was to give the people a more direct voice in the selection of political candidates. And here again, we're edging into this very controversial and uncomfortable territory where we're forced to reflect on whether reforms taken in the name of more democracy and more participation may have consequences that in fact result in increased dysfunctionality in our system. I know that's a heretical thought in the kind of democracy we live in and cherish, but the history of this institution and how it has evolved in relationship to the society over which the president presides does, I think, give rise to that kind of thinking. So I want to shift gears now and bring us right down to the present moment. And I've tried to talk here about the several evolutionary factors in our larger social existence that have affected the presidency. And I'm going to use a fancy word here when we talk about the decline of political parties as entities that select and vet and train and groom candidates for electoral office. That function has been displaced by primaries, which is why you can get situations today where in 2016, there were 17 candidates for the Republican presidential nomination. Many of them able to trying to rent a party as their vehicle for their own political aspirations. Why we had such a large Democratic field in more recent months, because the parties have really yielded their traditional functions of identifying, grooming, and bringing forward candidates to the primary process. And again, it's a familiar refrain by now, as we all know, primaries are justified in the name of more direct and simple democracy. But in practice, primaries are the venues in which the most ideologically motivated, and some would say most extreme factions in either party or any party actually mobilize and take part. And the primaries have the practical effect, therefore, of selecting for candidates who do not necessarily command majorities in their respective parties and represent some of the most extreme elements in their respective parties. That's the practical effect of primary elections, but not their original philosophical justification by any manner or means. So we have the primaries, here's the fancy word I'm going to use. Primaries disintermediate, that is to say they reduce the mediating function of parties as institutions that gather and resolve differences between various citizens and unite them around a common political purpose. The fragmentation of the media, as we've seen particularly in the explosion of social media devices, also disintermediates, that is to say, it reduces significantly what used to be the authority and the legitimacy of the so-called mainstream media to report the news in objective ways. And if you combine the fragmentation of the media that the social media environment gives us with what we now understand to be the insidious workings of something called confirmation bias, where all of us are much more prone to believe news reports or items of any kind that confirm our pre-existing worldview. You combine the psychological predilection for confirmation bias with the hyper-fragmentation of the media, and you have disintermediated the function of the traditional media to create consensus around an agreed body of data or facts, if you want to use that now loaded word. All right, I want to rather quickly here in the last few minutes before we go to some Q&A, bring us down to the present and talk just a teeny bit about the 2016 election and then about the political environment we're in today. Now, this is a familiar map to anybody who's followed our political life in the last few years. It shows the results of the 2016 election. It's a little bit gross because it reports visually on the basis of states. I think we get a little better sense of what our society really looks like and how it voted if we reduce or shift, I should say, to county level results of the 2016 election. And this gives us the result by county. And again, there's a lot of small counties, particularly in the Midwest and eastern parts of the country. Counties tend to be larger in the far west. But this gives us a much more, you might say, granular view of where voters were. People in the red areas, of course, voted Republican, and people in the blue areas voted Democratic. And here's a correlation that I think is actually quite instructive. Because of the movement of population over the last 2 centuries, in the increasing urbanization and suburbanization of the American people, half the American population lives in just 146 counties. And here they are. These are the counties that contain 50% of the American population. There are more than 4,000 counties in the United States, but 50% of the population lives in just 146 counties. And here is a way to correlate that. This is not a perfectly visual correlation by any means, but it's highly suggestive. If you look at the blue vote up there on the upper left and the concentration of population, those 146 counties that account for more than 50% of the population, the correlation is pretty strong. It's not absolute, but it's pretty strong. And it tells us something we already know, or reminds us that urban centers or metropolitan centers, conurbations, vote more Democratic than do rural and other areas. Now the next slide I'm going to show you here is actually a little difficult to understand just at first glance, but it tells a very dramatic story. The roughly 480 counties of the 4,000 or so that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 account for 64% of GDP. So if you look on the left, the blue counties, many of those counties are populous enough. The size of the cell represents the relative size of the county. So there's Los Angeles County, New York County up in the upper left. Size of those cells is big enough that you can actually label them with names. There's enough room in the graph, or the chart I should say, to actually put the name of the county in there. If you look to the right hand, the graph, the red counties, they account for a minor share of GDP. And most of them are so small that you couldn't possibly put the label in there because there's just not room, given the scale of the visual representation to do so. So this is a reminder of one important aspect of our present circumstance, and that is that the parts of the country that were doing reasonably well, producing the lion's share of GDP in 2016 voted Democratic, and the parts of the country that were doing much less well did not. So that's one kind of, you might say, materialistic or economic dimension of the election that we just saw in 2016. But again, I'm aware or sensitive to the amount of time I have left here, so I'll try to do this quickly, but I hope not confusingly. There's another dimension to this that I find particularly disturbing, and it has to do with the fact that we as a people have lost trust and confidence in a broad array of our institutions, including the presidency, and including government. And this is not just because of the current president of the United States. It goes back a long way. Here is a graph that tells us from good research data the kind of confidence we've had in government going back to the 1950s. And again, there's some ups and downs in this. A long decline in confidence in federal government from the late 50s down through the late 1970s. Some uptick, and again, a little bit of uptick around the events of 9/11, but a long-term secular trend where we lost confidence in government. Here is the confidence in the federal government's ability to handle problems. Again, this is data just from the 1990s forward, but again, a obvious long-term secular decline. Here this traces confidence in the three branches of the federal government. All have lost confidence in the American people, the legislature most of all, but the presidency included. These are people who have a great deal of confidence in the federal government. As you can see, pardon me, in Congress, I'm sorry. And we're down to the single digits of people who have confidence in Congress. This is people who have hardly any confidence in the federal executive. It's a strong majority by now in the 2014, these data. And that's bad enough that we've lost confidence in the executive, in the Congress, and the judiciary. But as these data show, we've lost confidence in virtually all of our major institutions. These data go down to 2015, and you'll see that there are only three, as of 2015, only three major institutions in our society in which a majority of people have confidence. Once you get past the police, there's not a single institution in which a majority of Americans have either a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. And I dare say that today, in 2020, the police probably wouldn't figure quite as strongly as they did here. Confidence in the news media at historic lows, down into the single digit range. Confidence in press and television, down clearly in the single digit range. Now that's bad enough, it seems to me, that we don't trust our major institutions of governance or of communication. But the story gets even worse, because as these data show, we don't trust one another the way we once did. So these are data from various sources, as you can see here, General Social Survey, Pew, Trust data, and so on. But the people who increasingly, going back into the 1970s, here as you see in the upper left, the green line traces people who say most people can be trusted, that's declining. You can't be too careful, that's ascending. And if you do it by region, the southern region is the most distrustful. If you do it by education, the people with least education are the most distrustful. If you do it by race, non-white people are more distrustful than white people. And then the one that really makes me worry at night, wakes me up at night with worry, is if you break it down by age. The younger you are, the more distrustful you are, not only of institutions, but also of other people, your fellow citizens. You look down here in the lower left, people, the so-called millennials born after the mid-1880s are the least trustworthy. They think most people cannot be trusted. Here's some more recent data from 2020. Again, the part to pay attention to here is the left-hand column. US adults overall, a near majority, pardon me, a slight majority think that most people can be trusted. But if you break it down by different ethnic groups and especially by age groups, it's a pretty grim picture. People, the 18 to 29-year-olds, 2/3 essentially think that most people can't be trusted. And to bring it right home to our own moment in time, here's some very recent data from June of 2020 about how people thought various institutions could be trusted to handle the COVID-19 outbreak. And again, in every instance, without a single exception, including hospitals and doctors, although they remain high, but every institution lost confidence, lost the public's confidence when it came to addressing the COVID pandemic that we're now facing. And this is the final bit of data that I will share with you. This has to do with confidence in the integrity of the 2020 election, the one coming up. And these are some recent data from the Monmouth poll, a reliable polling source. And again, the first question is, how confident are you that the November election will be conducted fairly and accurately? 36%, a third roughly of Americans down here think that probably not. And then if you ask a more specific and focused question here, number 19, how likely is it that the Trump campaign will try to cheat? A majority of people think it's likely or somewhat likely. And if you ask people how likely is it the Biden campaign will try to cheat, about 49%, a near majority of people think the same there. Pardon me, 39%, so a little over a third. So this to me is deeply disturbing, and how much of this lack of confidence in our institutions has to do with the fact that the presidency for a century and more has been overpromised and underperforming. That presidents have presented these ambitious aspirational goals, but because of the constitutional constraints, the Congress is still the place where presidential aspirations go to die. That our system has built in a chronic kind of frustration with the inability of the system to deliver on the kinds of promises that candidates routinely make. And what's more, we as a people not only distrust our institutions, but for reasons that are still puzzling to explain exactly how we got here, we distrust one another. But I'll leave you with this, a remark from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, published well over a century, 2 centuries ago, but still to this day, the most incisive and insightful thing ever written about the character of democracy. And he talks about the prospects of despotism in democracy. And he said, it is never more secure of continuance than when it can keep men asunder and all its influence is commonly exerted for that purpose. A despot easily forgives his subjects for not loving him, provided they do not love each other. If you substitute the word trust for love or loving, I think you have a warning about the dangers in our own political time, including the dangers that attend the evolutionary character of the American presidency. So I'm going to stop there, and I think if I understand the way we're going to proceed, Emily's going to come back on and do some fielding of questions.
Thank you, David. That was just fantastic. A lot of people have been asking about questions about the Electoral College, and they're wondering if would it be possible or likely that we'd end the Electoral College and go direct to popular vote? If there's arguments against this or risks associated with doing this?
We need another few hours to do justice to that question. It's a great question. I think the prospects that we will get rid of the Electoral College, I think, are very, very slim. It's embedded in the Constitution, and the process, the mechanism for constitutional amendment is such that you need supermajorities of the individual states eventually to approve of any amendment. And enough states are actually at the margins advantaged by the Electoral College that is very, very difficult to see how that can change. Now, there are 2 states today, Maine and Nebraska, that do their Electoral College business a little bit differently than others. They don't do a winner-take-all system. Instead, their Electoral College votes are awarded, at least in part, on the basis of how their individual congressional districts voted. And a number of states have signed something, I forget the name of it, but it's the Interstate Congressional Electoral College Compact or some name like that, where they pledge that if enough states pledge to give their Electoral College votes to whoever wins the national popular majority, they will cast all their Electoral College votes for that person, regardless of how their individual state voted. As yet, not a sufficient number of states have signed up for that, but go back to the prior point I was trying to make. If states started awarding their votes on the basis of how they allocated their Electoral College vote on the basis of how their congressional districts voted, you'd get a much more granular account. It would start to approach a kind of plebiscitarian electoral mechanism, and there may be some possibility for change in that direction. But abolishing the Electoral College altogether, I just don't see it happening in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And then there have been many questions about the use of executive orders.
Well, yeah, the increasing use of executive orders in the last several presidential administrations is an indication of exactly the kind of structural obstacles to unified, vigorous government, as Alexander Hamilton might have said, that I was talking about. When you can't get Congress to align with the president's ambitions and aspirations. The only mechanism left, essentially, to get anything done to the president is an executive order. And even that is not universally successful and can easily be overturned by the next or some succeeding president. Executive orders don't have the kind of legal and constitutional standing that statutes have. They're much more labile and volatile. So, but the fact that we see increasing reliance on them, it seems to me, is yet another proof of my theorem that we as a culture, as a people, we've invested increasing hopes and aspirations and ambitions in the presidency. We've fetishized the president as the person who's supposed to be all of our representative, the single national actor in our system, but the Constitution constrains the president from actually fully exercising that function.
In the event of a contested election, what are the steps to resolve the conflict?
I can see that this presentation has done nothing to allay people's anxieties about the immediate future. Again, I don't know what to say about that in any detail. I think the prospect of a whole set of problems like we saw in Florida in 2000 occurring in more than one state, having to do with the technology of mail-in ballots and with the contested and polarized moment in which we live. Just the technical and mechanical difficulties of voting in person in COVID time and the inability of individual states and the Postal Service to handle the volume of mail-in ballots that are necessary. I'm not going to make a prediction, but I'll just say the probability of a dozen Florida 2000s occurring this coming fall, the probability is not trivial. And I personally don't know what to say by way of what's a preemptive remedy, how we can avoid that, other than simply sounding the tocsin as much as we can right now, that we should not be surprised if on election night in November, the result is not definitively clear, and there will be a period of contestation about what the actual result is. And the fact that it will be contested does not mean it's illegitimate. Mail-in ballots in many states are going to take weeks to count and to legitimate and authenticate. So I think we should all brace ourselves for a period of unprecedented disruption and doubt and argument about the legitimacy and authenticity of the electoral result.
What worries you the most about the modern presidency, and what gives you the most hope?
Well, look, if you've stuck with me through the argument I've tried to make here, I think a lot of the problems with the presidency are structural. They go way beyond the personality or the character of any individual person. And, you know, I know it's heretical to challenge the assumptions that underlie our constitutional system, but it's also a fact of life that, to the best of my knowledge, of the countries that have written their constitutions in the last 3/4 of a century or so, in the post-colonial era, when many once upon a time colonial societies became fully independent and sovereign and had to draft constitutions. To the best of my knowledge, few, if any, have taken the American Constitution of 1787 as their model. Many more have taken some version of the British system, in which the legislative and executive functions are fused in a prime ministerial system. I don't want to be misunderstood as standing on the soapbox here and advocating that we change our system to a parliamentary system. We have the system we have. But the fact is, other peoples and other societies have recognized the built-in difficulties in our system. The founders in 1787 were animated by many things, but among their greatest fears was the fear of power. They feared monarchical power and they feared presidential power. They knew they needed an executive function in the federal system, but they jacketed it about with all kinds of constraints. We learned them in grade school or high school as checks and balances, which, at least the era I grew up, checks and balances were thought to be one of the great wonderments of the American system. But checks and balances also are a formula for stasis, or I dare say paralysis. So I think that the problems with the presidency go way beyond any problems that we might have with any individual person. It's just the nature of our system.
What are your thoughts on having the election of president be totally national election and not run by individual counties?
By individual
counties?
Well, yeah, that's right. It is that granular. I was just listening to a broadcast yesterday from Texas where they were, to my amazement, they were talking about major differences between different Texas counties and how they conducted their electoral machinery. So, yeah, I mean, this is a special case, a very important special case of a more general issue. Another one of our structural characteristics in this society of federalism. There's a lot to be said for federalism about distributing government power and authority down as close to the actual operational level as possible. But it also means that in moments of truly national mobilization or crisis, we have great difficulty behaving in a uniform manner. Another example of it, again, is controversial, and you can argue it either way, I suppose, is our educational system. There are thousands of individual school districts in this country, which make any aspiration for uniform standards of educational achievement and performance very, very difficult to implement. And we have, as you've just said, Emily, we've just been reminded, county level administration of things like voting mechanisms. So yeah, some mechanisms, we could move in the direction of more uniform practice, both educationally and in terms of election machinery. I think that would probably be a healthy development.
Is the relative lack of restraint of the powers of the president in the Constitution compared to the powers of Congress a factor in the growth of the power in the presidency versus the Congress over the last 150 years?
Well, yes, but let me take the occasion of that good question to make another point. It's related to what we've been talking about, but it's a little bit fresh in terms of our discussion here this morning. And that is the division of responsibility for foreign affairs, especially military affairs, between the legislature and the executive. Article 1 invests the right or the responsibility to declare war in the Congress. Article 2 defines the president as the commander-in-chief. And that distribution of responsibility for the conduct of foreign, especially military affairs, has long been, as the great constitutional scholar Edward Corwin once said, an invitation to conflict between the president and the Congress. But the fact is that the Congress has exercised its responsibility, its sacred responsibility, to declare war. There's scarcely any government function more consequential and full of gravity than that. Congress has exercised that function exactly 5 times in all of American history. War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II. But by actual count, the Congressional Research Service did a study of this a few years ago. So even these data are a little bit out of date, but as of approximately 10 years ago, there have been well over 300 US military actions overseas. So again, there's a huge asymmetry. 5 formal declarations of war, but 300 deployments and military actions overseas. So the point is simply, the president has great discretion in the realm of foreign affairs, especially military affairs, much greater than with respect to most domestic matters. And that's an invitation not only to conflict, but to adventurism and to a certain degree, unfettered and unrestrained presidential initiatives in the realm of foreign policy. And we've struggled as a society and as a country for more than 2 centuries to find the right balance between democratic deliberation over the decision to resort to arms and the necessity sometimes to do it in a hurry. There was a constitutional amendment proposed in the 1930s that had it passed, it would have required a national referendum to declare war, take the power away from Congress and invest it in a national referendum. And Franklin Roosevelt, among others, but Franklin Roosevelt opposed it, and Roosevelt said it would make as much sense to require a meeting of the city council before the fire department was authorized to put out a fire. And there are times when you simply can't afford that sort of deliberation. So that's an extreme case of the effort to bring deliberative democratic process to bear in foreign policy. That one clearly, I think, is not on the table. It shouldn't be. But I think we still need to think hard about how we can somehow better bring deliberative democratic processes into the realm of presidential initiatives and foreign policy.
How would you rank the presidents as having the greatest impact on the US, and maybe make your top 3?
Well, I'll recollect two things. Periodically, the American Historical Association, or the Organization of American Historians, my two principal professional associations, one or the other will conduct a poll of card-carrying professional historians about who were the most positive, effective, consequential, good American presidents. And consistently over many decades, 2 presidents appear at the top of those polls: Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. They both changed the American landscape socially, economically, constitutionally, attitudinally, in ways that are lasting and beneficial. I think there's very little argument about that. After you get past those 2, then there's a lot of argument thereafter about who else deserves to be in that pantheon. More recently, or actually the most recent survey of this sort I saw, actually participated in and witnessed the final version of, was at a meeting of the Organization of American Historians in Providence, Rhode Island, about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, in which there was a panel discussion about who was the worst American president. Mm. And there were several hundred people in the room, all of them professional historians of some sort, and a vote was taken at the end. And it came down, the people who usually show up in the basement in those polls are James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. The one failed to prevent the coming of the Civil War, and the other, Andrew Johnson, did a bad job of administering Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War. No surprise there. That's to date, the Civil War, the biggest trauma in American history. So those are the 2 usual inhabitants of the basement. But in this poll, in discussion at the Organization of American Historians meeting, the final 2 candidates for worst president ever, reflecting, I'm sure, the moment we all were living in, were George W. Bush and Richard Nixon. Now, they would not have been necessarily my candidates, but that's what came up at the end. And then there was a vote taken. And by a pretty large majority, Richard Nixon won, if that's the right word. Why? Because he had done the most damage to our political culture, for reasons not unrelated to what I was just talking about earlier in this hour, that he undermined confidence in the authority and legitimacy and honesty of a major political institution, the Presidency of the United States. And the Vietnam War, over which he partly presided, did a lot to undermine people's trust in the rectitude and legitimacy, and I dare say the morality of government. So yeah, again, I'm not sure I want to cast my ballot again here on this screen this morning, but it's a reminder that damage to our political institutions can get a president or any political actor a pretty low ranking in the judgment of history.
David, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and insights. It's been so informative and fascinating, and we're just grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to all of you out there, wherever you are.